Podcast iGEM Team Bielefeld Sebitech 2019. What is synthetic biology? Episode 2.
Alright, so in the previous episode we talked about synthetic biology and some of the tools we can use to edit DNA. We also learned that it becomes easier and cheaper to do so. This can have many benefits. You can give organisms traits that they did not have before, and of course, these can be beneficial from your point of view. However, just because something has benefits does not mean we should ignore possible risks. Therefore, the use and production of genetically modified organisms, short GMOs, is strictly regulated in the EU and most other countries. The regulations in the EU have been in place since 2001 and have barely been updated since. The latest change was that the European Justice Court legally defined in 2018 that all organisms that are modified using CRISPR-Cas9 have to be considered genetically modified organisms. But not everything that has a different DNA than it would in nature is considered genetically modified. There are some techniques that have been used for decades or even longer and are therefore considered safe. Organisms produced using these techniques are not considered to be genetically modified.
What are those techniques? Well, the obvious ones are breeding and crossbreeding. The differences between the plants are still caused by changes of the DNA, but they are introduced over a long period of time. People have been breeding plants and animals for centuries. The experiences from this time showed that intentionally bred plants or animals are pretty much safe to eat. So, anything produced using the traditional techniques of breeding is considered safe and is not regulated as a genetically modified organism. Another technique that is frequently used and has been used for decades is radiating plants with radioactive waste. Radioactivity is very energetic and can therefore alter the DNA of, well, anything. This fact resulted in all these scary movies about dangerous mutants after accidents at radioactive power plants. These DNA mutations are completely random. This means that they can not only lead to bad but also to beneficial traits within a plant or microorganism. It might cause it to grow faster, to be more resistant to certain parasites. Maybe it fixates more CO2. There are plenty of possibilities, and when we screen for such a beneficial trait, we will find it at some point. Again, this technique has been used for a really long time, and no negative consequences on human health or the ecosystem in general were observed. Therefore, the European law does not consider these organisms as genetically modified. They are regarded safe organisms. If, however, we introduce the same modifications using CRISPR-Cas or other techniques from synthetic biology, the resulting organism is considered to be genetically modified. It must undergo tedious risk assessments before anyone would or could even think about releasing it into the environment.
While it does make sense to regulate the release of organisms with possibly unknown traits, many scientists are confused as to why this applies to those constructed rationally, but not those that originate randomly. Moreover, we are okay with importing genetically modified plants from the USA, Brazil, Argentina, and some countries in Africa. We use them to feed our animals. We use their enzymes to cultivate our yogurt and to degrade lactose in lactose-free products. As long as there's less than 0.9% of GMOs or things produced by GMOs in a product, it's not necessary to label it, and many companies use that. We are all eating and have been eating GMO foods for a long time, and no damage has been observed so far. However, it's only legal to cultivate 2 genetically modified crops in the EU, but many countries, including Germany, opted out of allowing to plant them. So why is it that it's okay to consume GMOs, but not to grow or release them in the EU. People are scared that the genetically modified plants or microorganisms are going to damage ecosystems or are going to cause an increased use of pesticides and fungicides. While these fears make sense and are understandable, they have never been expressed regarding plants that are produced using radioactivity or selective breeding, while some of their traits come with the same risks. Therefore, many scientists argue that the regulation of the release of any organism, whether it's modified using novel techniques or decade-old methods, should be based on its actual traits rather than the way it was constructed. The USA is trying to acknowledge that in a new law that was proposed this year, and had been more open towards planting and using GMOs in general. They are planning to reconstruct the legal framework towards assessing the final traits of an organism, rather than the way it was constructed, which is something researchers from the field of genetic engineering were asking for years. However, the USA has been more open-minded towards GMOs ever since. They have issued approximately 20,000 authorizations for genetically modified organisms to be released. All of them were still based on risk assessments, and their impact on the environment is observed constantly. The results for most of them showed that there was no measurable impact on the biodiversity or on the health of people consuming them.
So what do we learn from that? While there are for sure risks that come with introducing newly constructed organisms with potentially unknown traits into the wild, those usually aren't caused by the method of construction, but by the traits themselves. Therefore, the regulations of GMOs should be reconsidered in countries that stress the methods and techniques during development rather than the final product. How strictly we want any modified organisms to be regulated is something that should be discussed on a scientific rather than an emotional basis. Arguments coming from fear alone will not result in a sensible law. Therefore, it is important to have a transparent and honest discussion about potential dangers of genetically modified organisms in society. During this discussion, it should be stressed that scientifically sound arguments are more valuable than those coming from personal experience or emotion, and the ability to differentiate between those should be taught to as many people as possible. So what do we learn from that? While there are for sure risks that come with introducing newly constructed organisms with potentially unknown traits into the wild, those usually aren't caused by the method of construction, but by the traits themselves. Therefore, the regulations of GMOs should be reconsidered in countries that stress the methods and techniques during development rather than the final product. How strictly we want any modified organisms to be regulated is something that should be discussed on a scientific rather than an emotional basis. Arguments coming from fear alone will not result in a sensible law. Therefore, it is important to have a transparent and honest discussion about potential dangers of genetically modified organisms in society. During this discussion, it should be stressed that scientifically sound arguments are more valuable than those coming from personal experience or emotion, and the ability to differentiate between those should be taught to as many people as possible. Moreover, anyone should be able to fact-check the basis of each scientific argument. This requires one to have basic knowledge within the field. It may help if scientists from within the field reach out and teach anyone who wants to listen about what they are doing. It's also important for scientists to be open-minded towards the concerns of society and to not disregard them easily. If we have a society-wide discussion based on these few principles, we would end up with a law that has been generated in a democratic process and would represent the now known facts as well as the wishes and needs of society.